Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Helene Silverman, and I'm very happy to be here. I see some very familiar faces out there, a lot of you. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sandra Shi. She is one of our outstanding researchers and a clinician. She is an instructor at Harvard Medical School and affiliated with Beth Israel Deaconess. She got her medical degree at the University of Chicago and then graduated from the Harvard Multi-Campus Geriatric Fellowship. So she is one of our outstanding researchers. Her field is frailty among the elderly and works and researches in that area. I won't bother going into any details, but she will tell you everything there is to know or that we want to know today. So let's give Dr. Shi a big welcome, and then you will have time for Q&A afterwards.
Thank you so much for the very warm welcome and introduction. Well, I'll move that down just a moment. So the subject of my talk is on using frailty to optimize patient-centered outcomes in post-acute care. And the picture that I have here is of actually a painting that one of my patients painted while he was recuperating after a hospitalization. And I work in the rehabilitation services unit in the Roslindale campus. And so this was a really lovely kind of illustration of this is towards the end of his stay with us during his recovery, just being able to kind of enrich his life and get back to the things that he loved doing. So first, a little bit about the Marcus Institute, which I think not everyone is necessarily familiar with. So I wanted to just briefly state that our mission is to improve the lives of seniors through focused applied research. We challenge assumptions about aging and replace them with new evidence-based realities founded on the results of rigorous scientific inquiry. But kind of said more simply, I think that what we're trying to do is rethink and redefine what it means to be aging. And we do that by a lot of different things, but most importantly, through our research. So we're actually one of the largest aging research facilities that exists in a clinical setting in the United States. We have obviously a long-standing relationship with Harvard Medical School, which helps to attract expert teaching staff and top-notch research fellows, of which I was one of up until just last year. In terms of our research portfolio, we're among the top 15% of institutions funded by the National Institute of Health. And we're actually number one among hospital-based geriatrics research facilities. And so this basically puts us in a position where we can really do what's called the kind of bench to bedside work, where we're not just doing the research in a hypothetical kind of lab or in a petri dish, but we're really thinking about how we can directly apply these findings and apply this research to the aging population. So again, briefly, our research cores consist of several, and they're all led by top-tier scientists that have really kind of developed the fields themselves. Our Aging Brain Center is led by Dr. Sharon Inoue, who is really a visionary and has basically put aging findings of delirium on the map. The original work in this has basically been defined and developed by her. The Musculoskeletal Health Division, who's led by Dr. Douglas Keel. The Palliative Care Core, led by Dr. Susan Mitchell. Our Biostatistics and Data Science Core, led by Dr. Tom Trevison. Our Mobility and Falls Core, led by Dr. Lou Lipsitz. And of course, our Clinical Trials Core, which is kind of, and then the Clinical Trials Core, which is our newest core. Briefly about me, I doubt anybody recognizes this. This is actually where I grew up. This is a place called Winnipeg, Manitoba. It's in Canada. And I spent my childhood there, grew up there. This is Winnipeg in the winter, which is, in my opinion, the best and the most unique time to go there. Otherwise, it's known for fishing in the summertime. But it is very, very cold winters, and what you see on the bottom is actually the Red River, which runs through Winnipeg. And it's so cold in the winter that the entire river freezes over, so you can go ice skating on the river. And so I have a lot of fond childhood memories of ice skating on a river that's completely frozen over, which I think now there's probably safety restrictions or something about being able to do this. My parents moved our entire family to Boston when I was in high school, so that's a picture of Brookline High School, which is where I graduated many, many years ago. And then shortly after graduating from Brookline High School, I moved to Chicago, where I attended my undergrad degree at Northwestern University. And then, as mentioned, I went to medical school and stayed there for medical residency training at the University of Chicago. And then shortly after my residency completed at the University of Chicago, I moved back to Boston with my husband, and I did the geriatrics fellowship here at Harvard Medical School. And that's a picture of my husband and some of our dogs. And this photo down here was actually very recent. This was in the Arboretum about 2 weeks ago. Some of the spring flowers are starting to bloom now, and it's just been really lovely. But speaking of the Arboretum, I already mentioned, but I work clinically at the Rosendale campus, of which this is a picture, and I work in the RSU, or the Rehab Services Unit. And it's actually very unique and special to Hebrew, because in most nursing homes or inpatient kind of rehab facilities around the country, it's just kind of mixed and blended into the rest of the nursing home. And so the person that's there who got a hip replacement or had a fall, they might be roommates with somebody with advanced dementia who's been living in that nursing home for 5 or 6 years. And obviously those two patients have very different experiences and very different needs. And so Hebrew recognized this very early on and said, no, we really need to have an entire floor that's dedicated just to rehabilitation, so that the people that are there to rehabilitate and recover can really focus on their recovery. In order to enable that, we also have higher staffing ratios. Each nurse takes care of fewer patients on that floor, because we're recognizing that right after a hospitalization, people's medications are different, they're changing, they might have a higher degree of care needs. And so in order to appropriately address that, we make sure that there's just more interdisciplinary involvement in a much more intense, focused way that's dedicated to rehabilitation. And so it's really during my geriatrics fellowship, when I did my rotation on the Hebrew rehab floor, that I was really taken aback by this very different approach to rehab. And I started wondering, well, why isn't it that we can't do that everywhere? Why is this something that is so unique that literally this is the only place in the nation I know that does this? So part of it is that the post-acute period, we recognize that after a hospitalization, say an older adult goes to the hospital after a fall, then while they're in the hospital, they may be lying in bed for several days. They become very weakened. And in fact, about 1 in 5 of all older adults in the United States has to go to a nursing facility for rehab after a hospitalization. And this is a really critical period of time, because this is sort of the make or break time for them to recover. And of course, when everyone goes to subacute rehab or goes to this nursing home for rehab, their plan is to get stronger and then be able to go home, wherever home is for them. But unfortunately, the reality is that this is only the case for about half of people, which was shocking when I first learned that. Because working as a resident and working in the hospitals, I never dreamed that only half of the people that I was sending to a nursing home were going to make it home. Unfortunately, about a quarter of them have to go back to the hospital because there was some complication, or maybe they got worse. And then some proportion just don't recover enough and have to move into long-term care. So this is the work that, realizing this is what got me interested in what's called frailty. And so frailty, for geriatricians, it's not just like a gestalt of how sick do I think this person is. It's a real kind of quantifiable measure. And what we're trying to capture is decreased physiologic reserve so that people are very vulnerable. And the reason I say it's not just, whether or not somebody is independent is because you might have somebody who is not frail and somebody who is frail, and they're both in this green zone. They're both independent. But say they're, the person who's not frail that has a fall and has to be hospitalized, well, they might have a short dip in their ability to take care of themselves, but they recover quite well, and then they can go home afterwards, or they are able to go back to their regular routine daily activities. But somebody who is frail, even though they started out also independent, they often will have a much more severe drop in their functional status after a fall or hospitalization. And they might take longer to bounce back, and maybe not even bounce back to how they were before. And so when we see this clinically, what we observe is that this can lead to disability and further hospitalizations. And obviously this is sort of a theoretical illustration, but when we looked at this even among patients in Hebrew Rehab's recuperative services unit, the blue and the gray lines are people who are not frail or only have very mild frailty. And you can see that after a hospitalization, everyone goes down in function, and they all kind of are at this point where they're going to need help and they're going to need some rehabilitation to recover. And the people that are not frail or only have mild frailty have really good recovery. The black arrow here is them going and leaving the nursing home, leaving rehab. And even when we call them a month or 2 months later, they're continuing to do really well. And some of them are actually even doing better than they were before the hospitalization. But what we worry about clinically are these people who are in the yellow or in the orange zone, who take much longer to recover. And even after going home, some of them actually have a drop in their function, or they don't really get to, you can kind of see this is where they were before. They're not really ever coming back up to this line before. And so when we look at these data nationally, we see a similar pattern as well. The green is the proportion of people that are recovering, and again, 1 or 2 months later, we're still seeing that some of these frail people are actually not recovering. So obviously, as a geriatrician that's focused in rehab, this is really concerning to me, that there's a population of folks that are not recovering and we're not serving very well for whatever reason. And so, well, some people say, well, if they're not going to recover, then what's the point? They're not going to recover. These are people that are they're just kind of on a downward trajectory. What are we going to do about it? Well, it turns out that just because they're not recovering as well necessarily, that doesn't necessarily, this could be very much a systematic thing. And so during COVID, we specifically looked at recovery, but again, stratified by frailty. And what we saw is that it doesn't matter whether someone's not frail, mildly frail, or has moderate frailty when they begin. Everyone responds to physical therapy. And so the light blue bar is how they were doing when they first came to the rehab unit, and the blue bar is how they were doing when they were discharged. And we can see that no matter how frail someone was when they started, when they got really good, robust physical therapy in response to even something as devastating as COVID, and this is very recent data from just about 2 years ago now, that even in that kind of a setting where everyone was on quarantine and on precautions and wearing masks, and it was actually very difficult to do rehabilitation, even those with moderate frailty were able to kind of double their therapy scores and double their independence by the time they left. And so moving forward, how I would like to continue to develop this work is, well, I mentioned that there was this green elephant. And I mentioned that this was painted towards the end of this patient's stay with us at Hebrew. Well, it turns out that he actually also painted this picture during a physical therapy session while standing up. And so this was, and I take no credit for this, but one of our physical therapists and our recreational therapists discovered that one of the best ways to motivate somebody is to get them to have them, incorporate things that they love, whether that's playing the piano or whether that's painting, and incorporating that into their physical therapy. So then rather than it just being, being on a bicycle for half an hour, on riding a stationary bicycle. And the other thing is that this also helps to emulate what somebody is going to be doing in real life when they go home, right? When someone goes home, they're not going to sit in a chair and do leg lifts all day. they're using the skills and the muscles that they built in therapy to do something. So when this patient, John, goes home, he's going to be painting. And so if you don't test that setting, if you don't test him, holding a paintbrush, having to change colors, having to take his hand off of the walker to be able to paint, taking the paper on and off, if you're not testing all of those things, then you're not preparing him to get back to doing the things that he really loves to do. And so this is not the only picture he painted. He actually painted this and all of these, and I'm missing an entire wall because he used up all of the paint supplies in the Hebrew rehab therapy art department. Our therapist was delighted, and we just went out and bought more paints. It was fine. But again, this was, literally every single therapy session was done in the context of how do we build in and incorporate the things that this person loves to do and get them back to doing those things. And so that's actually all I have for my slides. I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. My email address is here. If anybody who, I understand this is being recorded, and so if anybody wants to reach out to me that way, please feel free to send me an email. It's the HSL or Hebrew email, so it's all secure as well.
Hello? Thank you, Dr. Shi. Can you hear me now? Yes. That's a commercial. There are a lot of directors here today. The system, in terms of medical care and Medicare, is structured, it seems, differently and makes it more difficult in a rehab setting, in that when a patient reaches a certain level, they're often told, okay, you've reached a particular level, it's time for you to go, or it won't be covered, et cetera, et cetera. How does HSL treat that kind of structural barrier differently?
That's a fantastic question. And you're,
Could you repeat it?
yes, and I'm happy to repeat the question. So the question was that the system, meaning Medicare, Medicaid, and Blue Cross Blue Shield, whatever you want to call it, but the system of insurance and payment has a lot of rules and regulations that kind of govern how much therapy somebody can get, and what kind of therapy they get, and in what setting. And so the question was specifically, how does Hebrew maybe tackle those issues differently or address those sort of systematic barriers to being able to do good therapy? So to answer that, I'll actually hop to this slide really quickly. And again, I'll point out that one of the tricky things is that people who are more frail often will need more therapy, and they'll need therapy for a longer duration. And so traditionally, the barrier to this was, well, Medicare says we're only going to cover 10 days of therapy or 14 days of therapy, however they make their decision. And part of that at that point becomes how fiercely are you willing to argue with Medicare about whether or not somebody needs their therapy, and how much, the decision that Medicare, of course, it's all about money for them, is they want to see, is the dollar amount that we're paying on a day-to-day basis worth it? Is this person really benefiting? And so if you have a therapy staff and physicians that are willing to document, yes, this person is benefiting, or if they haven't been benefiting, why is that, and kind of justify why they still need a longer stay or they need more therapy, then those are the ways that we can kind of work and push back against the system a little bit. Thank you.
Hi. What did you say was the ratio in Hebrew's rehab of staff to patient? Because my experience was terrible. The staff did not come when I had a fall out of bed, sleeping, and they were very poorly trained.
So I can't speak to that specific context of when that was happening, generally speaking, on the Hebrew rehab RSU, meaning recuperative services unit floor, we try to maintain a staffing ratio of one nurse taking care of about anywhere from 10 to 15 patients. And believe it, that sounds like a lot. It's when I tell residents in the in the hospital this, they're shocked because in the hospital it's 1 to 4. Typical nursing homes, it's 1 to 40. So you can imagine if in a typical nursing home, if you were to go to, and I don't want to name specific nursing homes, but typical nursing homes, there's one nurse for the entire building, or there's one nurse for 40 patients. And so it becomes extremely overwhelming for that single nurse to care for all of those patients. So that's what I meant by we try to maintain better staffing ratios.
I have a positive question to ask you from me. I've been walking every single day, probably 7 days a week for a long time. I walk anywhere from 2 to 3 miles a day. My question is, I'm compulsive. Is it better for me to slow down? I walk fast because what's helped me a lot is I walk to a Jane Fonda walking tape, and it helps me move. So is it better for me to slow down or keep going? At my age, I'm old, or I'm very motivated, or keep going the way I am?
I think everyone hopefully heard the question, but I'll kind of restate it really quickly. The question was, if you have a pretty fast natural walking pace and you're walking 2 to 3 miles a day, is it better to try to keep that brisker walking pace or to try to slow down? And I'm guessing the concern is maybe try to, be more careful and try to avoid falling or anything like that. I don't have a slide on that specifically, but we do know that gait speed, or how fast you walk, is actually one of the best predictors of how healthy you are. And the faster your natural gait speed is, the better it is. And so if your natural walking speed is actually pretty fast, as long as you're not endangering yourself in any way, I would say, keep walking whatever your natural gait speed is. Because one of the things that we as geriatricians look for and get very concerned about is if somebody starts slowing down. Because then we have to wonder, why is it you're slowing down all of a sudden? Is it that maybe you have arthritis that's getting worse? Do you maybe have heart failure that is limiting your ability to walk more quickly? So your natural gait speed or your natural walking speed is actually one of the strongest predictors of how healthy you are overall. Because walking is an activity that involves every organ system. Your lungs, your heart, your muscles, every single part of the body is functioning at full capacity when you're walking. And so that's absolutely one of the best things that you can do for your overall health.
I'd like just to ask if you're aware of the fact that people who wear hearing aids have difficulty with clarity. And if someone speaks rapidly, unfortunately, the message sometimes get muddled. And I would just like to recommend to you that when you're presenting to an elderly audience like this, you'll be careful to slow down your speech.
I appreciate the recommendation.
Hi, Dr. Shi. Could you tell us how you define frailty and how you measure frailty in someone who comes in for an evaluation?
Absolutely. So frailty can be measured in a number of different ways. It typically depends on the context. So there are simple tools that are designed such that a general internist or a general primary care doctor can do in their clinic in under 5 minutes if they don't have the time, say. And then there are other tools that, as a geriatric specialist that spends an hour with every patient, I would use. So I use the most rigorous method, or one of the most rigorous methods, which is a comprehensive geriatrics-based frailty index, which assesses over 40 domains and actually calculates a proportion of how many deficits or vulnerabilities somebody has compared to their total possible reserve. And that gives me an actual specific number that I can work with. But there are other easier tools to use, for example, a clinical frailty scale. And that's, for example, the type of tool that I would teach to a medical student at Harvard Medical School. It's a scale from 1 to 9. And there are pictures, and they kind of can look at the scale and learn to grade or kind of assess patients with a quick kind of 1 to 9 scale. So the answer is it kind of depends on the situation and who is doing the assessment and how much training that person has.
I have a question. I thank you for your presentation. Do you ever come over here to Newbridge, to the rehab center?
That's a great question. I actually, not recently.
I have a reason for asking, so you generally don't.
No, not in the last 2 years. Basically, not since COVID, because we have tried not to have staff crossing campuses, because that's when we opened the COVID unit.
So I was in rehab during COVID, and it was not a pleasant experience. However, there were things that I had to suggest, such as, why aren't my legs being elevated? Oh, they should be. No one had left an order for that. There were other things that happened in rehab that I had to sort of take control of and ask for. So does anyone from HSL ever come over to see what's going on in the units? Because I realize you're in research with frailty and falls, but if there's no one there to see what's going on, the nurses are overworked, the aides are overworked, and something should be done about some kind of scheduling to see what's going on over there. Because I really had to take control of my own. I had to show the aide where the whiteboard was that said what my care was supposed to be. So either it was partly COVID, or it was partly training, it was partly, they certainly were staffed enough. So I'm just wondering whether someone at the Marcus Institute could come over to that rehab and see some of the patients in the aging and frailty and falls category instead of all of it being done at Roslindale. Thank you.
Again, that's a great point. Unfortunately, I haven't personally been working on the Newbridge rehab unit since COVID. I imagine that they were probably undergoing the same sort of stressors that you mentioned that I think every nursing home was probably going through. I know certainly Roslindale also was going through. But it sounds like you were doing all the right things, which is advocating for yourself. I don't think most people know this, but the turnover and also staffing has become particularly tricky. And so that is something that I think is an ongoing, it's an ongoing difficulty, to be frank, at I think even at Roslindale as well.
I won't go too far away. Okay. We really appreciate hearing what you're saying. The negative comments are welcome, too. Yes, I will get to you in a second. But we recognize some of these issues. And if we don't, we have to hear from you, and that's very good. So let me give you an example of how we are trying to rectify, for example, the nursing shortage. The nursing shortage is something that we're experiencing all over the country. And we ourselves, too, are. But we have set up a program in response to that called Certified Nursing Assistants. And these young people that go into that program usually come from backgrounds where they don't have enough money to get training. They want to get into the health field. We need them. We pay for them to go through this program. Part of it is paid through philanthropy, which some of you are helping with. But this is not a pitch for philanthropy. This is just to tell you that we are trying. And then we promise them a job for 2 years with us if they pass the test and become certified nursing assistants. So they get money while they're being trained, and then they have a job when they are trained and qualified. Now, to take this a step further, one thing that we noticed is that some of these young people, their English is not good. So we started a program in English as a second language. Before they can get into the CNA, Certified Nursing Assistant program, they have to go through the English training program to learn some of the medical terms. So we are having a difficult time, as all medical institutions are around the country, but you should know that Hebrew Senior Life recognizes it and is really trying.
So the question I have relates to my 105-year-old stepmother who lives in Philadelphia, who I just visited for the first time since her 105th birthday party, and her next one is, God willing, in June. So I noticed a big difference in her in her physical and mental status, some of which I attributed to her lack of stimulation, because at her age she doesn't hear worth a damn, even with her hearing aids. And though she used to sit near the television and listen to that very loudly for a while, it's all Ukraine, and this upsets her. She doesn't do that. She's obviously frail at her age. She has a couple of aides day and night to be with her, but she can walk a block with her walker if she stops a couple of times to rest. But I'm just wondering, in all of this stuff that you talk about, do you address stimulation? Because as the gentleman over here said, if you can't hear, it's not good.
Yeah, so again, I'll just kind of quickly repeat the question in case some folks couldn't hear it clearly. But whether or not stimulation, whether that is, being able to hear clearly enough or being able to get out and walk enough, or even being able to kind of visually see and read and interact with the environment in a way that is enabling for therapy, whether that is addressed. So the answer is absolutely, because we recognize that sensory impairment, whether that is visual or auditory, is one of actually the major drivers of whether somebody can successfully get rehabilitation. So, for example, I don't have any work specifically here, but there are researchers that are specifically developing tailored protocols for people who have visual problems as well as cognitive impairment. And their rehabilitation regimen looks completely different, because what they recognized is that for people with cognitive impairment, they needed shorter sessions more often. It's not the same as somebody who is completely, cognitively intact and can remember their therapist's instructions from 2 days ago and work on those exercises on their own. These patients often will need maybe 2 or 3 sessions throughout the day for a shorter period of time. And by modifying and tweaking just even that little bit, it makes a big difference in how well somebody recovers. So I don't have specific details here about it, but it is absolutely recognized in sort of rehabilitation medicine as a whole that it has to be personalized to the individual impairments and the individual drivers for a specific person.
I don't know whether you were planning to address some just plain practical issues, and as far as, for example, many people in this situation have issues about balance. Where do you start if you want to improve your balance and mobility? I don't know, I was hoping perhaps you had some suggestions to make. So
the question really quickly is suggestions for improving overall balance and kind of being able to reduce the risk of falls. number one thing I would say is that any sort of therapy has to be personalized and tailored to an individual. And so while, of course, we encourage regular physical exercise, whether that is walking or Tai Chi classes, all of which have been shown to reduce risks of falls, and making sure that overall medical problems such as cataracts and vision are also addressed, that the bottom line is, as a geriatrician, when I am putting together a fall protocol or a treatment protocol for someone after a fall, it is all extremely, extremely tailored. So the occupational therapy evaluation that I request, I'm not telling the occupational therapists what to do, because the honest to goodness answer is that I don't know what that person will need. It needs the occupational therapist to actually go into that person's home and do what's called a home safety assessment, where they will actually evaluate the home for potential risks of falls and see maybe somebody needs adjusting, equipment adjustments, and that will be a specific prescription. Same thing with physical therapy. We know that specific, hip girdle strength, for example, is very important, or leg power, how fast you're able to walk, how long you're able to walk for. All of those are important predictors when we look at the broad population. But when we're thinking about a specific person, that individual person has a very different set of risk factors, and those need to be addressed on a very personal basis.
So where do you start? Physical
Therapy referral, number one thing. Physical therapy, occupational therapy referral. But it really does take a village to do this kind of work, because we need everything to be specific. If you only fall when you are getting up out of, in the bathroom, then what is it about the bathroom that's making you fall? If you only get up when you're getting out of bed in the morning, if you only fall when you are getting up out of bed in the morning, what is it about the bed? Is the bed height right for you? Is there a rug on the ground that you're tripping on? Is there good enough lighting in the morning, or is it still too dark because the shades haven't been drawn yet? These are all things that typically, if you were going to go to a regular doctor, they would never think about. But these are the things that a geriatrician and a physical therapist and an occupational therapist and a full team of rehabilitation specialists will think about. And it's those things that are going to make a real difference. The quick and easy solutions never work, unfortunately.
I'd like to address the fact that many of these lectures that are brought to us are very informative, and they represent state of the art. However, the state of the art that's presented in these lectures is not filtering through the general population. We've been here for 4 years, and it's only been in the past 1 year that we've become cognizant of palliative care therapy. Since they have been in our lives, they have been very, very helpful. Why this was not addressed to me, I am a member of the medical group here. No one even mentioned it. It was only through word of mouth among other residents that I found out about it. I think that there's a distinct differentiation between what the geriatrician's object and approach to this entails, and what the internist, for example, entails. However, it's not being brought into the population at all.
Again, to briefly summarize the question, it sounds like the concern is that some of the state-of-the-art information and treatments that we're discussing and we kind of bring here are not trickling down to the actual working system. And I hear that, and I absolutely respect that, because I think that is true. And that's why the Marcus Institute exists. And that's why we're here at Hebrew. If you believe it or not, most therapies in the real world take over 10 years to become practice. There's an expression I learned in medical school that if the way you change something in medicine is you wait for the older generation to leave, because it takes that long for changes to happen. So 4 years, I know sounds like a lot to you, but that is blindingly quick for medicine. Because I can tell you what happened in the last 4 years is we doubled the size of our palliative care team, and we made them a presence. 4 years ago is when I started. There was one palliative care doctor at that time. And now we have more than 4 practitioners, and they span inpatient, outpatient, and rehab. Almost half of my patients in rehab get palliative care consults now. That was never a possibility when I started 3 years ago. And that is, again, recognizing the need from very important people like you guys when you say, this is a really beneficial service, we need to see that more. That's exactly the sort of thing that we need to hear, because only by saying that seniors are asking for this and they're saying this is helpful, can we justify getting more of these resources? Because otherwise, these sort of changes do take a really long time to happen.
I would like to agree. We need comments like this. I'll just make a suggestion, and then we have another question back there. What I find when I meet with people who are affiliated with Hebrew Senior Life, such as residents at Newbridge, there is not a lot of knowledge about everything that we do and what is available. What I'd like to suggest is maybe we can have a piece of paper out there. When you leave, you can write your emails down. We will connect with you, and the first thing that we could do is connect you with our website for the Marcus Institute. And when you go on that website, you will find everything that we do, not me, because I'm not a scientist, but everything that wonderful doctors like Dr. Shi do. And as far as the last comment about balance and gait, you will find that we have a whole group that studies balance and gait. And we do studies on it, and very often participants from Newbridge are part of those studies. So there is a way for you to find out what we do. And you can contact Deb Mayerson back there, or you can contact me, Helene Silverman. But we'll see if we can get a piece of paper. If you want to be contacted by us, not for development work, but for knowledge, leave your name and leave your email, and I think you're going to be astonished when you go to the website. Somebody back there had a question?
Well, I have a comment, actually.
Sure.
Which is, for some of you, many of you don't know me, and I don't know you. I've been here about 6 months. But I think Deb is telling me to say my name. I'm Blanche. The point that I think we're lacking, and maybe we're not the group to develop it, but maybe the higher level, is to whom in general we should make any comments of things that we think are missing, whether it's enough aids or how fast to walk or who to ask that question. I don't know who that would be. I've happened to have gotten to know some of the people, but the Marcus Institute, which I visited last week, is very nice, but it's research. And the people sitting here want the results of that, or the results of the research from 10 years ago to filter down. But they want answers today. What should I do? How fast should I walk? I don't want to enter your study. I want an answer for me. And I'm not sure we have that. And this may be improved. I understand there's another physician joining the practice here, and I don't know whether that will be helpful or not. But that, to me, is something that isn't entirely immediately clear.
I'd like to say something. My name is Dr. David Rosenthal, and I chair the advisory committee for the Marcus Institute. And this is the third in the session that we have planned for, and we'd like to hear from you what other types of topics you would like to hear. I think, obviously, Dr. Alter's right. We have to find out how to translate research into clinical application. That's very important. And that's what I think the Marcus Institute is trying to do. In addition, as you probably heard, we do have a new physician coming here who is going to be totally in charge of all of Newbridge as a geriatrician. He will be coordinating all the care between primary care in the medical clinic, the RSU, assisted living, and long-term care. He'll be coordinating all of that care and also seeing patients within the medical practice. So this is an opportunity for us to really coordinate all the activities to make sure we do have programs. For example, fall programs, we have a Tai Chi program that unfortunately not many people take advantage of. There are other types of programs in the physical fitness center, and people don't take advantage of. So I think there are things that are happening, more is happening, and I think we will have more clinical application. But in the meantime, I'd like to hear from you what other types of topics you'd like to hear from research, and then also how we can ask our researchers, how does this research become clinical application? I think that's the key.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shi. This was wonderful.